So, the Pentagon called an emergency press briefing, and two of the most powerful military officials in the United States, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, stood in front of the cameras and delivered a series of statements that, taken together, represent one of the most consequential military communications in recent American history. Now, the live coverage you watched gave you the words. What it didn't give you, what it almost never gives you, is the analysis. What did those words actually mean? What were they revealing? And what, just as importantly, were they very carefully not saying? Because in a military briefing of this magnitude, the silences are just as significant as the statements. In this debrief, I'm going to walk you through every major moment from that briefing, the operational details, the political signals, the contradictions, and the questions that the reporters in that room asked but never fully got answered. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened at that podium, but what it means for the trajectory of this war, the future of the Iran deal, and what comes next. With that said, let's get into it. I'm David Whitmore, Chief International Analyst at Global Insight News. Hope you're doing well. Come for the debrief and stay for the four things Hegseth and Kane said that nobody in the live coverage stopped to explain. Let me start with context, because to understand what was said at this briefing, you need to understand the timeline of everything that led to it. February 28th, 2026. At 1:15 in the morning, Eastern Time, 9:45 in the morning in Tehran, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military strike on Iran. The operation was called Operation Epic Fury, and what Kane described at the very first briefing on March 2nd was the scale of that opening assault. Over 100 U.S. military aircraft participated in the first wave. Tomahawk missiles launched from Navy ships, ground-based missile platforms across the region, and in the first 24 hours, more than 1,000 targets struck. 1,000 targets in 24 hours. Kane also revealed something remarkable about how the operation began. Trump gave the final go-ahead on Friday afternoon at 3:38 p.m. Eastern. His exact words, as Kane quoted them, "Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck. Close. Close. No aborts." 2 words, 4 letters, but they tell you everything about the command philosophy going into this operation. There was no provision for calling it off once it started. This was a commitment, total, irreversible from the opening moment, and Kane said the element of surprise was critical. The operation was highly classified. Ahead of the kinetic strikes, the physical bombs and missiles, U.S. Cyber Command and Space Force had conducted cyber operations to, quote, blind Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond when major combat operations began. You struck their eyes before you struck their infrastructure. That's not just military tactics. That's a doctrine. You don't just bomb the target. You first destroy the enemy's ability to understand what is happening to them. And that doctrine tells you something about how Washington was thinking about Iranian retaliation and how they planned to contain it. Now let's talk about what the briefings revealed about the cost of this operation, because this is where some of the most significant statements were made and where the political stakes are highest. At the March 2nd briefing, the very first one, Hegseth confirmed that the operation was underway and that the objectives would take, quote, some time to achieve. Kane was more specific. This is not a single overnight operation. The military objectives CENTCOM and the joint force have been tasked with will take some time to achieve, and in some cases will be difficult and gritty work. Difficult and gritty. Those are not words military officials use lightly. Those are words chosen specifically to prepare the American public for casualties, for setbacks, for a conflict that does not resolve cleanly in a news cycle, and the casualties came. By March 4th, 6 American service members had been killed. Hegseth addressed it directly. Much was made of the volume of missiles Iran was able to shoot in the first few days, and sadly, as we projected, a few got through and killed 6 of our best, who will hopefully arrive home soon. We will avenge them, no doubt. We will avenge them. That phrase, from the Secretary of War at a formal Pentagon briefing, is not standard military language. It is personal, emotional, and it signals something about the tone of this administration's military posture. This is not a bureaucratic conflict management operation. This is described from the top in terms of vengeance and resolve. By March 19th, the price tag had become public. The war had cost $25 billion. Hegseth, when asked about the Pentagon requesting more money from Congress, said, and this became one of the most quoted lines from all the briefings, "It takes money to kill bad guys." $25 billion in less than 3 weeks of major combat operations. For context, the entire U.S. annual defense budget is roughly $900 billion. This operation burned through nearly 3% of that in under a month. Now let's talk about the nuclear question, because this is where the briefings become most analytically important, and where the contradictions are most glaring. Hegseth, from the very beginning, stated that preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon was, quote, a core goal of the operation. He said, "These are not utopian goals. We will finish this on America First conditions." Strong language, clear commitment. The nuclear program is the stated justification for this entire operation. But then, at the congressional hearing on April 29th, which was the first time Hegseth and Kaine faced public testimony under oath, Democratic Representative Adam Smith asked a question that nobody has been able to fully answer since. He pointed out that Hegseth had said, referring to the 2025 war between Israel and Iran, that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. And he asked, if it was obliterated, then why was it an imminent threat 60 days ago that justified starting this entire new war? Iran's nuclear program is exactly what it was before this war started, Smith said. Hegseth's response was revealing. Their facilities are bombed and obliterated, he said. Their ambitions continued, and they're building a conventional shield, bombed. But the ambitions continued, obliterated, but still building. That is not a clean answer. That is an acknowledgement, in 4 words, that the military campaign may have damaged facilities without resolving the underlying strategic problem. You can bomb a building, you cannot bomb an intention, and that distinction between physical destruction and strategic outcome is the most important analytical question hanging over this entire operation. Let's now turn to the ceasefire, because this is where the political dynamics get most complex. On April 8th, 38 days into major combat operations, Trump announced a 2-week suspension of bombing. Hegseth stood at the podium and delivered what became the defining statement of that briefing. The Pentagon's job is done for now. For now, 2 words, but they carry enormous weight, because they tell you that Washington is treating this not as a peace declaration, but as a pause, a tactical halt, a moment to assess. Kaine gave the fuller picture. Over the course of 38 days of major combat operations, the joint force achieved the military objectives as defined by the president. We welcome the ongoing ceasefire. We hope that Iran chooses lasting peace. Achieved the military objectives as defined by the president. That phrase is precise, and precision matters in military language. The objectives as defined by the president, not as defined by the full scope of the strategic challenge, not as defined by independent analysts, not as defined by the Iranian nuclear question, as defined by the president. Which means if the president defines success narrowly, as degrading Iranian military capability, destroying command and control infrastructure, eliminating naval assets, then those objectives were achieved. If you define success more broadly as permanently preventing Iranian nuclear capability, achieving a stable regional peace, or resolving the underlying tensions between Iran and its neighbors, then the picture is far more complicated. By May 5th, nearly a month into the ceasefire, Hegseth and Kane were back at the podium, this time to address the Strait of Hormuz operation. The U.S. was actively trying to guide commercial ships through the strait using guided missile destroyers, more than 100 aircraft, and 15,000 service members. 15,000 service members to escort civilian cargo ships through a waterway. That is not a post-war posture. That is an active military operation in a nominally ceasefire environment. And Iran had already responded. U.S. Central Command confirmed that Iran launched cruise missiles, drones, and small boats at civilian ships under American military protection. U.S. helicopters sank 6 Iranian small boats involved in the attacks. Hegseth's response was a masterclass in careful language. The ceasefire is not over. Iran's aggression is below the threshold of major combat operations. Below the threshold. That phrase, below the threshold, is doing an enormous amount of diplomatic work. It's saying Iran is shooting at us, but not hard enough that we have to call it war again. And that is the strategic tightrope the administration is walking right now. Now, let me give you the 4 things from these briefings that the live coverage did not properly contextualize, because this is where the real analytical value lies. First, the War Powers Act clock. Under the 1973 War Powers Act, the president must begin withdrawing troops within 60 days of initiating hostilities unless Congress authorizes continued military force. The Iran war hit the 60-day mark on April 29th, the same day as Hegseth's congressional testimony. The Trump administration's position is that the ceasefire stopped the clock. That because fighting has paused, the 60-day limit no longer applies. But as The Hill reported, Senator Lisa Murkowski was already pushing for a Senate vote on an authorization for use of military force, an AUMF, to give the operation proper legal cover beyond 60 days. Not everyone on Capitol Hill agrees that the ceasefire stops the clock, because 15,000 troops are still in the region actively escorting ships taking fire from Iranian forces. That is a legal and constitutional question that has not been resolved, and it is one of the most significant structural questions about this operation that the briefings have consistently avoided engaging with directly. Second, the casualty count discrepancy. At the April 29th congressional testimony, Kane referenced 14 members of the U.S. military who had died during the war, but the Pentagon at that point had only publicly identified 14 casualties, making it unclear whether Kane was citing a new number or confirming the existing public count. Al Jazeera reported specifically that it was not immediately clear what was behind the discrepancy. In any military briefing, casualty numbers are among the most precisely chosen figures when there is ambiguity around them, when the number referenced does not cleanly map to the publicly reported number that warrants scrutiny. And it connects to a broader pattern across all these briefings. The administration has consistently been more willing to discuss operational success than operational cost. Third, the question of ground troops. At the March 2nd briefing, Hegseth stated clearly, there are currently no U.S. troops on the ground in Iran, but he declined to go into the exercise of what we will or will not do in the future. By the April 8th briefing, during the ceasefire discussion, Kane confirmed that troops had in fact been on the ground to rescue fighter pilots. Now, rescuing downed pilots is an emergency operation, not an invasion. That distinction is real and important. But the sequence matters. The initial statement, no ground troops, was technically accurate at the moment it was made. But the operation's own dynamics required ground presence to execute its objectives. And Trump was also reported to be weighing action to seize Karg Island, which would definitively require boots on the ground in Iran. Iran warned that American troops could be set on fire and called on regional neighbors to eject U.S. forces. The ground troops question has never been fully closed, and that matters enormously for understanding the future trajectory of this conflict. Fourth, and this is the one I think is most significant for what comes next. At the March 31st briefing, as Hormuz tensions were escalating, the Trump administration argued that the ceasefire had paused the War Powers Act clock. But simultaneously, Trump was publicly threatening to resume attacks if Iran didn't comply with negotiations. He wrote on social media, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." He described Iran's proposal as inadequate. He said a whole civilization will die if Iran didn't agree to a deal. And Hegseth confirmed that the U.S. had, quote, a target set locked and loaded of infrastructure, bridges, power plants ready to execute immediately. A target set, locked and loaded, ready to resume. That is not the language of a concluded military operation. That is the language of a paused one. And the pause, as of the date of the latest briefings, is being maintained through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and what can only be described as strategic ambiguity about what happens if talks collapse. Let me now give you the honest analytical assessment, because this is what the briefings, taken together across the full arc from March 2nd to May, actually tell us. What was achieved significant. Iran's navy has been effectively neutralized. More than 20 Iranian naval vessels destroyed, including a frigate, a submarine, and dozens of smaller craft. Iran's air defense systems degraded. Command and control infrastructure struck. Intelligence assets disrupted. Defense industrial base described by Kane as decimated. That is real military achievement, and Hegseth and Kane are not wrong to describe it in those terms. What was not achieved, also significant. The nuclear question remains unresolved in any durable way. The facilities were struck, but Hegseth himself acknowledged the ambitions continued. Iran's proxy network, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iraqi militias, was not dismantled. The Strait of Hormuz was not freely opened. And the broader strategic question, what comes after the ceasefire, what kind of Iran emerges from this conflict, and whether the region is more or less stable, remains completely open. And there is a tension at the heart of the administration's public communication that these briefings have never fully resolved. On one hand, we achieved the military objectives as defined by the president. The Pentagon's job is done for now. On the other hand, we are not going anywhere. We are rearming. We are prepared to go back on offense. We have a target set locked and loaded. Those two things cannot both be entirely true at the same time. Either the job is done or it isn't. And the answer, the honest analytical answer based on everything in these briefings, is that the military phase of the operation has achieved its defined objectives. But the strategic challenge, preventing a nuclear-capable Iran, achieving regional stability, securing a durable agreement, that work has not been done by bombs and missiles. That work is diplomatic. It is patient. It is the kind of work that happens not at a Pentagon podium, but in the 60 days of negotiations that Hegseth said would follow. And those 60 days are running. So what do you watch for next? 3 things. First, the congressional authorization question. If the War Powers Act clock is still running, and serious legal scholars argue it is, then the administration needs congressional authorization by early May to keep U.S. forces in the theater with legal cover. Watch whether that vote happens, whether it passes, and whether the ceasefire is used as a reason to avoid holding it at all. Second, the nuclear negotiation. Every briefing has emphasized that preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon is the core goal. But the facilities were bombed, the ambitions continued, and the verification question, how does anyone confirm what remains of the program, has never been publicly addressed. Watch whether the final Iran-US deal includes meaningful, enforceable, inspectable commitments on the nuclear file. Because without that, everything else is a ceasefire, not a resolution. Third, the Hormuz trajectory. 15,000 U.S. service members are currently escorting civilian ships through a strait that Iran still claims sovereignty over and is still attacking. That is not a stable situation. It resolves in one of two ways. Either the diplomatic process produces an agreement that includes Iranian compliance on Hormuz, or the military operation resumes. There is no third option that maintains the current situation indefinitely. The ceasefire is real. The peace is not yet. And the next Pentagon briefing, whenever it comes, will tell us which direction things are moving. That is the full debrief for today. I want to hear from you. Which moment from these briefings did you find most significant? Was it Kane's no aborts order from Trump? Hegseth's locked and loaded target set, the nuclear contradiction at the congressional hearing, or something else entirely? Drop your analysis in the comments below. This is a story that is still unfolding, and the most insightful takes in these comments are what helps me decide what to cover next. If this gave you analysis the live coverage didn't, share this video, because understanding what military officials are actually saying, not just what they're saying, is exactly the kind of media literacy that matters right now. Hit the like button if this debrief was useful. It helps this analysis reach people who need it. And subscribe to Global Insight News, because this story is not over. The 60-day negotiations are running. The war powers vote is coming. The nuclear question is unresolved, and we will be here to decode every development with sources, with context, and with the same refusal to accept the briefing room framing as the whole story until the next edition. Stay analytical, stay skeptical of the talking points, and remember, in a Pentagon briefing, the most important words are often the ones nobody asked a follow-up question about. I'll see you in the next edition.